post this morning, and I'm very grateful.
I appreciate that. I think we're live.
We're live.
Good stuff. I want to welcome everybody to the latest edition of Power Lunch. I'm super excited to have this particular guest today. I was on it. Well, I'll get into all of that. We'll talk about everything, but I'm really glad to have you here. A couple of housekeeping notes real quick. So, Power Lunch is always sponsored by Seven Figure Circle, $1 Million Mastermind. It's a free Facebook group for 6 and 7 figure entrepreneurs who want to scale, grow their businesses, create more freedom, impact, and significance through their businesses and in their lives. You hop on over to my Facebook profile. You can find the link there. It's big banner. You can just click on that. It'll get you access to get inside. We got some incredible trainings. People like Brian. We haven't gotten Brian yet, but I'd love to have you come and do a masterclass over there. Maybe we can talk about that as well.
Yeah,
man. Some amazing trainings, amazing content to really help you to power your business, and it's all free content. So I can think of a better price, but it's a pretty compelling offer. So hopefully you'll be able to join there as well. And we're going to get started here in just 1 second. I got a whole intro, man. I got to play the intro. So we're going to do that, and then we're going to get started with the show. Power Lunch with Brian Bogert. And we are live. Power Lunch. I'm really, really excited. I met this gentleman. I was speaking for an event. Michael Faber had an event, Movement Makers Live in Nashville, Tennessee. I've seen Brian. We've actually been connected. We were connected through Brian. I had seen your content a little bit, but didn't know a whole lot about you. And when Faber put us both on the bill together, we connected. We were excited to meet each other and kind of learn more about what we were up to in person, which is always a great way to do it. And when I did, man, you were absolutely amazing. I love everything that you stand for and what you're about. And I'm really excited to be able to share you with the audience today. So I want everyone who is watching to give a warm welcome to Mr. Brian Bogert.
Man, thank you so much. I feel completely the same way, brother. I really felt drawn to you. You were operating at a vibration and frequency that was clear in that room. And you know, I love, one of my good friends, Meltzer, calls it our frequency neighborhoods. And brother, man, you're a part of my frequency neighborhood. And so I'm excited that we have gotten to become friends. We're going to do some great things together and have a lot of collective impact. But can I pause for just 1 second? Because your intro, bro, when I was watching your intro, when you played that, I was just like, oh my gosh, like, dude, you're a stud. Like big time stud. Like I knew that from in person, but the way that intro came together, like I couldn't tell if you were a model, the craziest, most successful business person, like just like general, like amazing human being, all wrapped up in one. And so those titles that were there, I was like, cool. But the feeling I got from those images and the way that you put that together, brother, man, just really cool and super impressive. And I'm lucky to be here with you.
Well, I'm honored. I appreciate that. I am not a model, but I play one on TV. So we do what we can. But I love the way you put that, man. Frequency neighborhood. And I'm a huge fan of. I'm assuming you're talking about David Meltzer.
Oh yeah. Good buddy of mine. We do a bunch together.
Yeah. I'm a huge fan of his. I love what he does, and I agree. It's interesting because there's a lot of talk about putting together your tribe and your circle, your network, things of that nature. And I think one of the things that really comes together is that when we get dialed in on who we are, then we start to attract the people that we need to go to the next level, right? And so being around those people is really important. So I feel like I'm doing something right because we've connected. And so let's kind of let people know a little bit about who you are and what you do. On the Facebook post, I told people you're more than a businessman, but you do have business. Yeah. You do operate in that space. So tell people a little bit about yourself, what you do and who you work with.
Yeah. So I always have to start. I'm a husband and father first. Period. End of story. It's the only thing binary in my world. If my wife and kids are not good, I'll walk away from everything we're focused on.
Mm.
I'm an individual who's deeply fascinated and curious about the human experience, human connection, human behavior, and all of the ways that those help us either connect with who we are, who we're doing this for, who we're doing this with, who we're doing this for, like the planning to impact on, or not connecting, which is what happens most often for a lot of people. I'm deeply focused on helping individuals really understand and identify the pains they need to embrace to avoid the suffering in their life, to really understand the pains they need to heal so they can shed the associated layers of armor so they can actually show up vulnerable and authentic based on who they are. And I believe that so many of these things are really connected to our desire to truly want to be free, experience joy, freedom, and fulfillment holistically. And so we're on a mission to impact 1 billion lives as quickly as possible. And what that means to us is that we want to reduce the level of suffering that exists on this planet. So much suffering exists, but I'm a big believer that the majority of it is internal suffering. It's the things that we actually can move ourselves through, but there hasn't been a model, there hasn't been a way for so many people to break the shackles of their shame, the fabricated fear that they can't move through, like drowning in their doubt because of the world has told them that who they are isn't good enough, right? Or they don't fit in the box of who the world told them they should be. And so I believe that we have an ability to build a world where we can stand on our own 2 feet, not only confident, but convicted in who we are, knowing that the world will not just accept us, but will embrace us for exactly who we are. And if we can all live that way, we will all get what we actually want most, which is to connect at the deepest levels with ourselves and those around us. And so the reality of it is, man, is I'm an individual who's been on a journey. Some call me a practitioner of pain because I've felt the depths of pain, both mentally, physically, spiritually, and emotionally. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about my story through today, but the reality of it is that's who I am. And so what I do is a manifestation of who I am at this point. I was really misled for a long time and chased all the what's of the world, but it cost me who I was. And I've spent the last decade flipping that on its head and helping other high performers, other entrepreneurs do the same thing. So the ripple effect in their lives is significant and they can move faster with less effort.
You said so much there that's so powerful. And I love the movement and what you're up to. You mentioned your story. Stories are what help people to understand the context for what we're delivering in the world. Let's talk a little bit about that. Where were you born? What was your upbringing like? What was that foundation that kind of set the stage for you to begin doing the work that you do today?
Yeah, so I have a really kind of interesting upbringing. I was born in Phoenix, but only lived here for a little while. We lived in Southern California for about 1.5 years after that. Then we moved to Australia for 1.5 years. Then we moved to England for 1.5 years. And so by the time I was 7, I had moved and lived in multiple different countries. And we really didn't have an established community outside of the 4 people inside our walls, which was my mom, my dad, and my brother. And so in a lot of ways, we had severed connections just because of the geography or where we were at, despite the fact that we had lots of people in our life. But the 4 of us were a unit. And, my brother was my best friend. He still is one of my best friends today. But, as is the case in so many areas in life, we moved back to Arizona. And again, my parents are incredible people. And they're like every other set of parents, by the way. They did the best they possibly could from a position of highest intent. And that doesn't mean they did everything perfect. But they always led with their hearts, and they did everything they could to make sure that they built the right life, the right structure, and the right foundation for my brother and I to grow and scale as human beings, despite whatever they came from, despite whatever baggage and emotional triggers they brought into that environment. They did whatever they could. So we come back to Arizona. They want to lay roots. They decide that we've moved a lot at that time. And so we end up going and we end up buying a house. We're living with my grandma while we're renovating this house. And as we were renovating this house, we were finalizing a project. My mom, my brother, and I went to our local Walmart to get a 1-inch paintbrush. And we were headed back to the car. Anybody who's known me for about 5 seconds or anybody who's listened to this show for a couple of minutes knows that I talk fast. I walk fast. I have a lot of energy. And this is not something that many people are surprised by when they interact for a second, that I was the first one to the car. Of course I was. I wanted to put that paintbrush to use. Mom and brother were a few feet behind me, and I had to wait for her to catch up because this was back in the days before key fobs. So she had to literally grab her key, reach in her purse, put it in the door, and turn it so we could go on our other way. And as I was standing there waiting for them to catch up, there was a truck that pulled in front of the store, parked, and the driver and middle passenger got out. Passenger all the way to the right felt the truck moving backwards. So Frederick, he did what any one of us would do, brother, and he scooted over to put his foot on the brake, but he instead hit the gas. A combination of shock and force threw him up on the steering wheel, up on the dashboard, and before you know it, he was catapulting 40 miles an hour across the parking lot right at us with no time to react.
Wow.
We were parked in an end spot. Went up and over the median in the end spot, went up over the tree in the end spot, hit our car, knocked me over, ran over me diagonally, tearing my spleen, leaving a tire track scar on my stomach, and continuing on to sever my left arm completely from my body.
Oh.
August 10th, 1992, 115-degree day, 6:10 p.m. Mom and brother watch the whole thing happen. They look down, they see me on the ground, and they look up and they see my arm 10 feet away.
Wow.
I can't tell this story without also honoring the woman that is responsible for me being here. And yes, my mom is one of those, but my guardian angel was there that day. There was a nurse that walked out of the store and she saw the literal life and limb scenario in front of her. I am forever indebted to this woman for choosing to move into action versus to go on with her day and turn her head. And so when she came over, she stopped the bleeding on the main wound and saved my life. You bleed out pretty quick when you've got a major limb come off, right? And so she literally saved my life. Had she not been on the scene, I would have died. She also instructed some innocent bystanders to run inside, grab a cooler, fill it with ice, and get my attached limb on ice to give me a fighting chance of having a reattached arm, not having any clue whether or not that would be success or what was involved in that process. But if it wasn't for this woman, I either wouldn't be here with you today, Frederick, or I'd be here today with a cleaned up stump. That's just the reality. So what I appreciate about what you said is I'm sure that so many people listening today were not expecting it to go there unless they had some understanding of my story from some other reason. But what I'm also very, very aware of, and you said this best, right? Stories are how we connect ourselves into the world with context and perspective so that people can understand where we've come from, where we are, and where we're going. But what I've also learned is no matter how extreme and unique my story is, yes, it's a unique story, but every single one of us has unique stories. Right. Regardless of the extremities of those stories. And so what's important for all of us is that we pause long enough to become aware of the lessons we can extract from our stories and then become intentional with how do we apply them in our lives. We all have the ability to do that. We also all have the ability to tap into the collective wisdom of other people's stories to shorten our own curve to learning. And so that's how I'm fulfilling my purpose on this planet at this moment, because my purpose is to allow my truth to give others permission to live theirs.
I just want to pause and let that sink in because it's such a. And you were how old when this happened again?
I was 7.
You were 7 years old. So, and it's funny because we have different events in our lives. Most of us maybe not have something that is so starkly or dramatic in terms of impact, but you had something there that was a defining moment, literally, right? What was it about that period of time in your life that really sticks out to you, that maybe even connects an arc to who you are today? Something that a lesson or it could be a phrase or something that someone said. But what was it about that moment, that time, and even maybe your family, how they rallied around you in that moment to really set a foundation for your course going forward?
Yeah. You know, it's hard for me to distill it down to one because there's a few. So I'm going to hit a couple of the core lessons and then I'll probably go deep on one, if that's okay.
Sure. Sure.
You know, I learned really, really early not to get stuck by the things that have happened to me, but instead get moved by the things I can do with them. And so what I've learned in all this time is that moved people move people. And so I'm in a position where I'm just trying to move more people. And where that lesson came from is when I'm laying in the hospital bed at 7 years old, feeling sorry for myself in those couple of weeks afterwards. And yes, 7-year-olds have those same thoughts. Like, why me? Why did this happen? What is my life going to look like? Right. And in moments feeling like it was a dream and not even reality, I didn't have anything to ground to. Right. And we were having families come up to us in the room and saying, we're so sorry for what happened to you. We're so sorry. Is there anything we can do to help? Come to find out their kid's laying in the hospital bed next to me with a terminal illness and doesn't know if they're going to live another 30 days.
Wow.
Perspective hit me pretty hard out of the gate. Because at the end of the day, I didn't know if I'd successfully have a reattached arm, but at that moment, my life was secure and I had no risk of it beyond that. And so, you know, if my life is here, then everything else is gravy. And I started to ingrain that philosophy pretty early. I will tell you that one of my core philosophies that truly is a lot to do with my parents, and this is the second concept I'll share, but this isn't the one I'm going to go deep on yet. You know, at 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, yes, I was the one going through surgeries. I had 24 of them over the course of 5 years. Yes, I was the one having physical therapy 3 days a week before school. I had to go for 2 hours to do occupational and physical therapy to relearn how to use my arm, how to function in the world. And I did that for years, right? Though I was in that position, I was also a little bit in a fog because I was being guided through the process. My parents, however, were not. They were intimately aware of the unceasing medical treatments, years of physical therapy. And the idea of seeing their son grow up without the use of his left arm was a source of great potential suffering for them. So they literally willed themselves day in and day out to do what was necessary, to do what was tough, to ultimately embrace the pains required to strengthen and heal me.
Mhm.
And so whether it was intentional or not, what they did was they ingrained in me a philosophy and a way of living, which was to embrace pain, to avoid suffering. And I also believe that's where we gain freedom. In this whole concept, what I really believe is that we almost choose our pain, or our suffering will choose us.
Mhm.
And so I learned this through practice, application, and understanding, and how it was applied to my own level of healing from the physical nature. And I've used those same philosophies to heal myself mentally, spiritually, and emotionally.
Mhm.
One of the last pieces, though, that I will say is the really common string that connects to today. Each one of these things did, but if I'm really honest with myself, this is one that had a greater impact in my life than my accident or either one of those two lessons. And it's a foundational piece to really helping me understand like the human experience today, looking back on it. I was 7 years old, 8 years old, 9 years old. I'm in a sling. I have a teddy bear literally between my body and the sling because my arm had to be at 90 degrees so that this bone would heal appropriately.
Mhm.
I got very used to people coming up to me and asking me what happened to me. They were literally expecting me to say, oh man, I flew off the swing and I beat my friend, or man, I crashed my bike, or right? Any normal 7 or 8 year old kid story on the playground.
Right.
And
Right.
I just look at them deadpan and look them in the eyes and say, I was run over by a truck and my alarm was torn off. I got really used to seeing faces go white, jaws hit the ground, and then immediate pause. And this is what happened. They'd pause and they'd turn and look at my parents for
Mhm.
validation. They didn't believe my own story.
Wow.
So very, very early, two things were happening in that dynamic. One, not only was I owning my truth, it wasn't being accepted or understood or believed. And so in the context of the human experience, I wasn't being seen and understood, and I wasn't being connected, which also meant I wasn't feeling safe or protected.
Mhm.
Right. And then
Mhm.
I also had them layering on all these things that viewing me through their lens on what they'd be capable of in my situation, all these things that they were going to tell me that I wasn't going to ever be able to do again.
Mhm.
That I wasn't
Mhm.
going to be able to do this. I wasn't going to be able to do that. I wasn't going to be able to do this. Right. And so, yes, there's foundational elements to shame that exists in my life in other ways. But if I really look at it, that was such a foundational period that really started to make me believe that who I was wasn't good enough. That who I was wasn't going to fit into the box that the world wanted me to see. And oh, by the way, the world didn't even see who I was because my own story that I was wearing on the outside wasn't even believed.
Wow.
Think about all those people that have inside stories, that have inside turmoil, that have inside things that the world doesn't see. They don't wear it as a badge of armor, right? And yet again, they're still deeply misunderstood. And so when I think about this from a connection standpoint, what I've realized over these last few years is that when I lost my arm and I disconnected from the pain that I was experiencing because it exceeded my ability to cope, I also shut off emotional pain, but I also shut off the connection to myself because I started to believe that who I was and my story wasn't good enough.
Wow.
And so I went unintentionally disconnected for such a long period of time. And there's different periods where I focused on human connection and vulnerability and authenticity, and emotion started to become prevalent back in my life. But that is the piece, my friend, that ties so much to what we do today, is because we are all hardwired to connect, yet we've never been so disconnected. And so my big goal is to allow people to recognize that who they are is perfect. And if we can all start to recognize how do we connect at the deepest levels with ourselves, then it's not so difficult to connect with other people. But most people don't want to sit in silence enough to actually put in the work to shed the layers the world has put on them to get back to the core of who they are.
So, of course, you said so much there. And those are some tremendous lessons. I think, so what I want to do is I want to dive deeper into that pain piece, because that's something that you really, really break apart really, really well.
Yeah.
But I also want to give people a little bit more context about what happened in the rest of the story. Like there's a whole gap between 7 and the grown man that we see on our screen right now. Where did your path lead you after that? You've grown up a little bit. Your arm is, you've come through the surgeries, you've come through the rehab, your arm is successfully reattached, but there's a life to be lived and there's a path to be chosen. What was that path and what did that look like as you continue to develop as a young man?
Yeah, and I'll distill this relatively quick because there's pretty big bucket themes in my life that are easy to tie. Right after that accident, I told you that I started to really go inside myself because I didn't want to be defined based on the limitations the world was putting on me.
Right.
And so I created a very, very strong mental narrative to protect myself. I didn't realize I was protecting myself back then, but that's exactly what I was doing. And this mental narrative, right? Because I heard in the world, like, if you got a good mindset, if you got good mental toughness, you can accomplish anything. And I in no way mean to vilify that statement because I do believe that to be true, but it's only part of the equation. I didn't realize that for years later. But my mindset was, I'm good, I'm strong, I'm capable, I can do anything myself. And so what did I do? I went out and I was going to prove to myself and prove to the world all the things I could do. right? And at a level that they were certainly not expecting me to be able to perform. And that was something that I just felt like I had to accomplish.
Right.
And for a long time, I think that there truly was some resentment, a little bit of angst around it, because I felt like I had to prove it to the world. But if I'm being honest, 25 years after I got out of that pattern, I started to recognize it was more about proving it to myself. Right. And so that went into that pattern. At 20 years old, I re-break my left arm in a snowboarding injury, almost lose it again.
Wow.
I went through 7 surgeons over the course of 10 months who were afraid to touch me. They would not go through normal courses of treatment because they were terrified of the medical malpractice. And the really interesting thing is that the physician that I connected most with, who was my primary one that did all the rebuild, actually ended up being the one 15 to 20 years later doing a surgery to repair my arm again. Wow. So we ended up getting reconnected with him, and he memorized like the inside of my arm like a road map, which was insane. But he did the soft tissue work so an orthopedic could repair that. Wow. Well, it was that period of time, my friend, I got into a deep depression. And I was very disconnected, but I also realized the power of our narratives because the world had bought into mine. I didn't realize they'd bought into mine because I had lots of friends. I had lots of family. I had lots of people that were around. But when I was in this most vulnerable period, nobody was there. And again, I'm not even upset at them. When I say that with the emotion that I do, that was my own blind spot because the world bought into my narrative because they believe that Brian's good, Brian's strong, Brian's capable. He can do anything himself. And if he needs help, he'll ask for it. But I didn't have the courage in my most vulnerable period in life to accept and admit to myself that I needed help, nor did I have the ability to ask for it.
Right.
And so I started to recognize how disconnected I was, and I started to shift my focus over that next window of time towards human connection. Vulnerability and authenticity are the glue that binds human connection. And so I really went after both of those, understanding those two concepts truly from an understanding perspective, an intellectual perspective, an application perspective. And I truly changed the way I was connecting with people. This was also in the time that I was building the first part of my career. I spent 15 years in risk management, employee benefits consulting. The last 10, I helped build a firm from nothing to over $15 million in revenue with 2 partners, 3 partners at the end. And we really started putting ourselves in a position where we were creating the lives that we wanted. And I was doing this through human connection. But then I wake up at 27 years old and I realized that everything I ever wanted, all the whats I just told myself I was going to have, the house, the car, the money, the freedom, the ability to do the things I wanted to do, I had it all at age 27. And I don't say that to impress, brother. I say it to impress upon the point because what it cost me was who I was. I wake up in circles now all of a sudden running with people making multiple 6 figures, 7 figures, 8 figures in some cases. And I realize that I'm miserable. And I start looking around and so many of the others are as well. And I believed that there had to be a better way. That put me onto a path of discovery. And it was not long after that we had our first son. He's 8 now. And I missed the first 6 months of his life. I told everybody that I was going to do everything in my life for the benefit of my family, but all I was providing for them was financial security. I wasn't providing the connection, the leadership, the presence, and all the other things that I could provide inside that household. And so that was the first time in my life that I felt like I didn't have the answers. I didn't have the intellect to figure it out, nor did I have the people in my life to figure it out. So I went and I hired my first coach, interviewed 14 of them, or 15 of them. The first 14 were an inch deep and a mile wide, had no relevance or credibility, and I almost gave up on the path. And then I found one that landed and connected. Working with him, in the first month, he said, Brian, you got to be doing this. I said, what are you talking about? He goes, you got to be coaching and speaking. And I said, what are you talking about, man? He goes, you build people and you build businesses. He said, why don't you make it a profession? And I said, yeah, whatever, dude. I'm paying you a lot of money not to tell me how great I am, but tell me, figure out these other things. Like, let me get more intentional. Let me get this structured and figure this out. And so we went through this process, but he trickled it every month for 9 months. And it became very clear that he was telling me what I needed to hear, not what I wanted to hear. Right? Because the universe sent me a big sign and I jumped in with both feet, started my coaching business, and then we started to take off. Reality of it is it was a couple of years after that, after I was doing high performance coaching, really focusing on mindset, mental toughness, and application through discipline, right? Which all are things that I believed in that moment. I'm laying on the couch with my daughter. After playing, she puts her arm around my neck, kisses me on the cheek, says, I love you, Dada. And I broke down in tears. And I'd never experienced joy in that way before. I did one other time. I just didn't identify it as that. It was the day I got married. All of our wedding pictures, I'm a blubbering idiot. There's not a good picture because I literally cried. I was like so happy and so joyful that I had gotten this to the place where this beautiful, incredible woman wanted to spend the rest of her life with me. And I felt so like connected and seen. I was crying the entire time. Now, at the time, I was like, why am I crying? Now, in hindsight, now I'm like, no, I was like pure joy that day. But when this happened with my daughter, it caused me to realize that if I haven't experienced joy this way, I certainly haven't experienced fear, guilt, shame, angst, or any of the other emotions. Everything was paled in comparison to what was really happening.
Mm.
So I started to really go inward on the emotional piece. And what I started to realize is that human connection without emotion isn't really human connection.
Right.
Vulnerability and authenticity are the glue that binds it, but emotion has to be behind both of it. And so it really evolved and started to change these things. And it wasn't many years after that, by July of 2019, my wife gave me a big push. And she said, hey, you're living in a state of fear that I've never seen you operate. You're dying a little bit inside every day. You live in risk management, employee benefits consulting. We need is 100% of you. We don't have it. I don't care if we live in the cardboard box on the corner. We want you. But I also know that you're barely scratching the surface of your potential, nor are you having the impact on the world that you want. So why don't we double down on that bet and go see what can happen?
All right.
I spent 3 months having to unpack my own emotional reaction to that, right? And then I decided that that's what needed to take place. And so we put the wheels in motion, and here we are today.
Now, I want to talk about that just quickly. You said it took you 3 months. What was that emotional reaction to that? Because you had made the transition. You had started doing the work that your coach had recommended you do, but there's another level to it.
Yeah.
And so what was the emotional reaction and what was the aftermath of coming through that?
Yeah. The prior period to that, I really started to become aware of the level that shame impacted my life. And so truly I was swirling in my shame. I was drowning in my own doubt. I was literally stuck because when she said all that to me, it felt right, but my narrative didn't match. I knew this is the path that I was meant to be on, but everything the world had told me up until that point told me that I'd be crazy to take this leap. And where and how was I actually going to make this happen? And so when she challenged me, because that's what she did. Again, my partner stepped out and legitimately went into a position where she told me what I needed to hear, not what I wanted to hear. She wanted me to see myself the way she saw me. And I wasn't at that time. And so twice over this journey, as you can hear, with my first coach and now with my wife, they put me into a position where legitimately that's what we focused on. So I had to go inward with my shame. And I had to really understand, even though I was starting to see the patterns in my life, I needed to understand, how do I move through this and what's actually holding me back and where and how do I start shedding these layers? Because that's what the reality was. And I always credit Brene Brown whenever I talk about shame, because I knew shame, but I didn't understand it at the level that I needed to, because look, the first talk track is I'm not worthy and I'm not good enough. I'd be lying if I said to the world that I didn't ever live there, but that's not been my predominant narrative. It just hasn't, right? But when you shut that down, you show up in the arena and you're ready to go to battle. It's who do you think you are? See, everything major I ever did in my life, I felt the need to apologize for. I felt the need to pull the throttle back in my life. And so where shame was impacting me in this is, who am I to walk away from an organization and a business that's growing double digits every year, that's given me all the financial freedom that I ever wanted, that's allowed my family to have the things and the experiences that we have? Like, who am I to do this? Literally, that was the thought process. Like, I've got it all. I literally had it all based on how the world has told us we should have it, with no risk of a lot of it being impacted because of the foundation we'd set. And so truly, I had to get around that. And then I had to really understand that if my number one role is husband and father, how do I secure my family's future? Because I knew what my wife was doing, which is she was ready and willing to give up whatever lifestyle, whatever pleasures we had, just to let me live my dream. Love this. Yes, I love when family gets involved. Hey, sweetheart.
You say hi, Alea.
Hi.
About once every a couple of times a week, she'll impose her will on the show. So you said, and hopefully I'll be in the show anymore. One of the things that's fascinating to me is how, especially as entrepreneurs, right? We have this belief that the next level is the thing that's going to make it better, that will be fixed. If I can just get to 7 figures, if I can just get to 8 figures, if I can just, crush this record, get this accomplishment, get the 2 Comma Club award, whatever it is, right? So when people hear you say that, right, I had it all and it didn't make me happy. There are people out here who literally don't believe you, right? Yeah, that was you. There's something wrong with you. And for me, that's what I need, right? What was that like? Well, let's go back before you hit that point, when you were them, right? When you had created this superhero narrative in your head. Where can you look now and even see that it was showing up in that moment for you? And kind of talk about that. Speak to people where they were or where they are now. Maybe they haven't gotten to that point, but there are a lot of people who are listening to this who have, right? So what did that look like for you?
Yeah, you know what's interesting? That's a really good question, Frederick, and I'm happy that you asked it. I'm not actually sure anybody's ever asked me that question in that way. I'm deeply grateful for the way you phrased that, because I think it's important, right? You know, I told you that I came out of college. Well, I don't know that I said this actually on today's show, but I came out of college bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and I was going to climb the corporate ladder, and I was going to just crush it, right? That was my goal. And I had all of those opportunities. But I will also tell you that, like, I had this belief that some of the negative patterns existing in a position of high performance, I wouldn't be privy to because they weren't aligned with who I was.
Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, what I mean by that is I always said, right, that I'm not going to be that guy or that gal. I'm not a gal, but I'm just saying it so that everybody's inclusive here. But I'm not going to be that guy that performs at such a level that all I've ever done is provide for my family financially, and I wake up 25 years later and they're not there. And I will tell you that it wasn't until after I left that world that it became so apparent how close I was to losing them. For all the reasons I said would never happen. Right? I grew up in a way that I wasn't going to be flashy. I wasn't going to go out and try to demonstrate or operate from ego or put myself into a position where I needed to have the world see who I was or what my success was. Yet I would go into positions knowing that it wasn't aligned with who I was. I would drink to numb and blend in so that I could appear I'm a part of the crew I'm supposed to be a part of, right? I legitimately had armor. And I want to be really clear when I say these things. I'm not vilifying any of these activities. I'm talking about them through my experience, okay?
Right.
Because alcohol was not something that served me, but it did for a while, and I'd convinced myself that it did for a while. The reality of it is the worst parts of me come out when I drink. And so good, bad, or indifferent, like it just wasn't actually additive to the path I wanted to live on. But the more I did it, the more I went down a path that I wasn't aligned with, right? I would buy custom suits because that's what made me feel like I could show somebody that I'm successful. If I had a $3,500 sport coat, damn, you know that somebody's going to look at me and want to do business with me, right? And that was truly like my narrative, because that was what I was starting to believe because of some of the circles in the path. And the more I got down a path that wasn't aligned with me, the more I found ways to justify why I was doing it. And so when I actually started to have these awareness moments where it's like, yeah, I mean, putting on that suit jacket, yeah, did it make me feel good in certain moments? Yeah, but it wasn't fleeting, right? Me going out and buying a $100,000 Escalade because I could, and I wanted everybody to see me in this brand new Escalade, right? Like, it was a complete ego-based thing. And I lost a ton of money on that. And it didn't ever give me the joy, freedom, and fulfillment that I really desired. I loved driving it, right? But the reality of it was it also wasn't aligned with me. Yeah. And so I knew all these moments of resistance, yet I still leaned in because of my insecurity. And so what I started to realize is I was chasing money to feed my ego, convincing myself that I was chasing it to feed my family. And when I saw the divide and the disconnect based on who I always said I wanted to be, and I started to realize that I was becoming the person that I always didn't want to become, it really became clear for me that there was no way that I was going to actually feel what I want in here. And if I quote NF and one of my favorite lyrics from him, right? If money is my primary source of happiness, I was always going to be poor.
Yeah.
And so again, I'm in no way vilifying money. I've made a lot of it. I plan to make a lot of it again in the future. Money is a tool. It's a vehicle. It's also an energy. And so for me, I just needed to maintain and focus on what is the intent of creating income for me, which has typically largely been impact based. I will say I'm very proud. There have been many years that my wife and I donated more to the community than we saved for ourselves. And I don't say that to impress, but my shame wouldn't let me tell people that at one point. I'm proud of that. That's something that we believe was really ingrained in who we are. We always believed in giving until it hurts. And so though I always did that, even when I was operating in these spaces, that's where I was getting my joy from, was from the impact I was creating through the income I generated. So I figured if I could align those things and focus on impact first, income would never be an issue.
Right.
And oh, by the way, so far, that's what's been proven. And so, like, truly, that was where I was at. I always said, oh, I'm never going to be that guy that's going to wake up and lose my family. Guess what? I almost lost him a year and a half ago because we started to unpack layers. We started to realize the damage I'd created in my house, and it got so deep, I didn't know if I was going to be able to repair it because of patterns that I had created because I was actually operating in a position of insecurity, ego-based consciousness, and living behind this armor where I was highly protective, highly defensive, and I was like a fuse that was ready to go off at any moment.
Can you tell a story about one of those moments that kind of brings it home for people? Because sometimes we can talk about this, and when you come through an experience, often you look back at it in hindsight, we're almost divorced a little bit from the emotion or the practicality of it. And I know you're not, but I want you to kind
I was, I mean, truly.
Okay. And can you tell a story that kind of illustrates where that was and what the catalyst was for you to be able to kind of create this breakthrough to the next phase?
Yeah, and I'll tell you that I'm going to give an example that really was connected probably to the damage that I created, less about like the transformation from the career side, because again, it permeated into both worlds, and it had a ripple effect that lasted even after I left the world that wasn't serving me. And so, but I think it's important to understand that these are the things that are really tied to our triggers, right? We talked before, and you even say, it's like, oh, if I just get to 7 figures, I get to 8 figures, I do this, I'll be free. That's what we always convince ourselves. If we focus on the strategy and tactics, we focus on the end goal and the outcome, the what that we want to accomplish, and that's what's going to make us be successful. That's what's going to make us be seen. That's what's going to make us feel whole, right? But the reality of it is working with some of the world's highest performers and doing this on myself, it's become very, very clear. Those things are critically important for leveraging and scaling our lives and businesses. Strategy, tactics, outcomes, they are. However, that's not the stuff that keeps us stuck. The things that keep us stuck are a combination of emotional triggers, behavioral patterns, and environmental conditioning, right? And so an example of this would be, I told you, I'm a husband and father first. Though my actions didn't always align, I intellectually always believed that that was my focus. I was so convinced that being a good husband and good father was truly my number one for so long that what would happen is my wife would come to me with a totally uncharged, innocent question like, hey, babe, what are we going to do with the kids this weekend? And my shame filter would cause me to hear it this way. Hey, honey, you've not done enough to show up as a good husband and father here in the last couple of weeks. And so I really want to know what you're going to do to make up for it this weekend so that you can show us that you love us.
I got to interrupt you. When you told, and you mentioned that in Nashville, and that resonated with me so hard because I have had this similar experience. My wife's love language is quality time. Right. One of them. And so especially she works hard during the week. She looks forward to family time on the weekends. And so she would want to do stuff. For me, I didn't get that downtime. And so the last thing I want to do is drive the family around, quote unquote, and just spend a lot of time doing other stuff. I'm thinking automatically of all the work that goes into having fun. Right.
Yeah.
And so there was, until we were able to actually create a different level of a different experience around that, I had to reframe that. So that really resonated with me. I didn't want to interrupt.
Yeah. But no, thank you. You know, and so what would happen though, because that's what I heard, regardless of whether or not that's what she said, that's what I heard. Right. So I filter it inside. It hits at one of the core things that I feel like is in my identity, which just has told me that I'm not seen and understood. I'm not feeling connected in the moment. And I'm certainly not safe or protected because she's coming at me when I know that this is something I'm doing well. Like literally that was my narrative. Right. And so what would happen? I'd get defensive. My chest would elevate. I'd feel a little bit of the anger and resentment bubble up, and I'd rattle off the 10 things I'd done in the last 2 weeks to show her I was a good husband and father. That wasn't even what she was asking. Right. And so that was an area of clear and decisive moments where this pattern was existing, where I wasn't clear in seeing myself and the reactions that I was having. And when we react from an emotional trigger, we typically create damage. When I rattle that off on my wife, of course I create damage. And you don't think that triggers her? Her armor goes up. She's going to get defensive. When I'm coming at her with a big, intense energy, showing her when all she was wanting to do is, what are we going to do with the kids this weekend? Right? And again, so what I started to see was that there were so many patterns in our life that were actually connected to me as the trigger. Now, I was not at fault for the ingrained triggers that existed in my wife before our relationship, which made the triggers I brought into our relationship even more sensitive. But the ones I created and the ones I didn't create also became my responsibility once I became aware of them. Because when we create damage, we have to create repair. And I believe that as the protector and connector in my household, it is my responsibility to ensure a safe environment for everybody. My wife did not feel safe in those moments. But I can list times that I reacted and blew up at a business partner. I can list times that I reacted and had a stronger energy or edge to somebody in the community, right? that was misplaced, that was misappropriate. And so when I really started to pare this back and look at how I was operating, blind, truly, to who I was coming across as, because our actions demonstrate who we are to the world. So no matter what we believe up here, it's how do we show up? How are we delivering that? What energy do we bring? What reactions versus responses do we bring? How do we neutralize and diffuse resistance and energy drain? How do we elevate and empower other people? Like literally our actions demonstrate that. And so regardless of what I believed up here, if my actions weren't consistent, and yes, I want to be clear, I did a lot of really amazing things for a lot of people. And that's not justification, but there was enough moments of blindness that created damage and a ripple effect in my world that limited me from being who I was. Yeah. And so her ability to bring this to my attention, we having these conversations and learning how to pause in those moments so I can take back influence and control over the process from that moment forward to recreate new patterns and to break generational patterns that we inherited based on our emotional triggers. That's where we create freedom for ourselves and our families.
Yeah. You touched on it a little bit about speaking, to business partners and things of that nature. And oftentimes leaders and entrepreneurs are not thinking about how their personal relationships are revealing things that are actually showing up in their business.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about, because I know you've done some work, you do work with leaders and entrepreneurs in this regard. Talk a little bit about how you help them to understand those connections, right? When you're willing to blow up a deal, or you're willing to make a bad decision in your business, or lose an employee, or whatever the case may be. I'm jumping the gun. I'm answering the question for you, but illustrate a little bit. Maybe you have an example of a client or somebody that you've worked with that was really doing that and connecting the dots for them.
Yeah. This happens consistently across the board. And again, these are deeply ingrained through our triggers. So I do want to be clear, and I'll just kind of quickly hit on what do I mean when I say triggers? Triggers are those deeply ingrained emotional responses that are either unhealed, unresolved, or unprocessed in a way that transports us to a place that is not right here. It's those moments that your wife or your spouse or your husband or whoever looks at you because you loaded the dishwasher incorrectly, and it has nothing to do with them. It has nothing to do with the dishwasher. It has everything to do with how your grandpa looked at you when you were 4. And the reality of it is that we often are not in a position where we have a level of awareness around these triggers and how they actually impact us in our business, right? So business leaders who come in and they operate from scarcity, they're going to often show up in a position where they've got perfectionism or control, or they're going to not be able to delegate effectively, or they don't communicate with absolute clear expectations to their team. They'll gaslight their team for things that they themselves are not doing, right? Because it's a protection mechanism, right? We often are going to put ourselves in a position to do this. And so what we don't pay attention to, and I talk about emotions often at this point as energy, right? And any one of us can imagine this, who's had any kind of long-term intimate partner, right? Or a business partner. Both of them are intimate relationships. They truly are. Right. And if we have had those in our lives, then we understand that a conflict, a look they give us, one comment, one tiny disagreement can actually shift our energy immediately, where all of a sudden we are feeling a little bit guarded, we are feeling a little bit more protected, or we're feeling angry and resentful and we lash out. Right. The reality of it is so many people don't take the time then to pause just long enough to recognize the energy that they're operating from before they walk into the next environment. Right? How many times would I take a business call on the way home and it'd be bad news from a client? And if I didn't go through a process to park around the corner, intentionally center myself so that I could be where my feet are instead of there, then I'm walking into the house with that energy. Right? How many times did something happen on the road driving to the office and there's a jackass that cut me off and something took place and all of a sudden I'm heightened? Guess what? I'm walking into a team meeting. Do I have the proper energy? Am I putting myself in a position to bring the right energy to connect into every interaction? And so often we operate from a position of unawareness and unconsciousness in the way that we do this. And so it does change the way we connect. And so, yes, I've got many examples with clients that were operating from a position where they didn't understand or see what was actually happening. There was one guy that I worked with that was literally in a toxic, shame-based environment that was tripping everything that he did. And despite the fact that he was outperforming the goals and the timelines that his partners had outlaid for him, they were constantly riding him and it was never good enough. Now, he had a deep ingrained level of shame that was pitted against competition with his brothers for so long. And the reality of it is he never had the ability to put himself in a position to really understand this. So when he got faced with challenge, though he was a really nice guy, right, his energy would immediately change. His wall would go up and they would feel disconnected from him. So it actually would perpetuate the cycle because he wasn't allowed himself to stay open because he didn't feel safe around his partners. Now, did he have language to describe that at the time? No. It was a pattern of actions and reactions that we had to download and understand to really be able to understand, to bring this and hold a mirror up to him so that he could see himself more clearly. And so these things really do matter, right? You and I have a negative conflict with your beautiful little girl sitting on your lap. If you're not really aware, that energy transfers. 100%. And so often, again, if we look at the human experience, because this brings it all together, and you've heard me use some of these words, we all desire to feel safe. We all desire to feel protected. We all desire to feel seen and understood. And we all desire to feel connected. These last two are the two that we desire the most, but they don't happen unless the first two do. Right. So when we walk into an environment, we don't feel seen and understood. We don't feel connected. How many associates have gone in and a boss doesn't ever see what they've done, the contributions, the work they've done, and it's never good enough. And all of a sudden they feel like crap because the boss is actually taking out their shit on their team. And so the reality of it is like when we start to understand these things, when we don't feel safe, we protect ourselves and our armor goes up.
Right.
Guaranteeing that we will prevent the very two things we want most, being seen and understood and being connected. And so this is very important because most of the time, these emotional triggers, again, are not our fault.
Right.
We create damage as a result of them and we continue to pass them through the world. And so I'm just trying to bring this to a position of awareness so that we can all start taking responsibility to create less charge in our interactions externally in the world.
There's so much. First of all, it's also powerful. And it's funny because these are words that do not show up in the business environment. It's not even in the vocabulary. It's not even in the frame of thinking, right? We're thinking it's all about results, numbers, dollar signs, more clients, more, bigger, faster, better, all those things. And you mentioned it earlier. None of those things can happen when we are restricting them with these words, like even creating an environment of safety for your clients, your customers to come into.
Yeah.
People don't even talk about that unconscious layer that really needs to exist there and how people can begin to make those shifts in their culture of their businesses, in the culture of their organizations, as well as in their own families.
Yeah. I've said for a very, very long time that everything begins and ends with you. Right. I'm a big believer that we need to constantly force ourselves to find, even if it was not our fault, where we can take ownership for the outcome of any interaction, because we always bring something to the table. And so even if it was something that we didn't receive openly enough, even if it was something that we didn't do, if we can force ourselves to see where our responsibility comes, it starts to change the dynamic. Now, I've said these things for a long time, but I have to quote my good friend because he says it better than anybody. If you are constantly, and Alex Sharfin is his name, so I almost completely went over it and I didn't quote who it was. If you're constantly putting out fires in your business and your life, there's a good chance you're the arsonist. And so when you start to pay attention that when you are not having the results that you want, you aren't getting the outcome from your team that you want, you don't have the level of engagement with your customers that you want, you don't have the leadership on your sales team to make sure that we actually are driving with an upward trajectory to make sure that people are feeling connected to they do. You're having conflict with a business partner. You're in the middle of a lawsuit around something. Guess what? There's an emotional trigger tied to that. And there is going to be a piece of you that's going to impact that interaction if you're not very, very aware. Our minds process 11 million bits of information per second, but we're only consciously aware of about 40. So until we go through a systematic process to move the unaware to the aware, the unconscious to conscious, it's going to feel like we're victims. It's going to feel like life is fate. It's going to feel like we have no influence or control over our destinies. How many people, when life gets tough, starts pointing their fingers outward? Oh, well, my business partner screwed me over. Oh, man, my boss passed me up for that promotion. Oh, man, my wife, man, she's just been in a really hard place, and I can't believe she's processing this. Man, my kids are total pains in the butt, right? How often is it never about them? When in reality, they're often the common denominator through those interactions. And so often, all we're trying to do is to get people to recognize that it's not about blame, fault, because you can look at these things objectively and non-judgmentally. People do things that are bad. That does not make them bad people. People make mistakes. That does not mean that they are bad, flawed, or unworthy, right? People are people. And so part of this is we've got to also establish a culture that embraces failure, understands what that looks like, where and how do we fabricate growth through failure, where and how do we look at communication and connection. And so when we see these things pattern forward, you're right, they aren't a part of business. But everything that we do in business, I don't care if you're even a tech company, it connects to people. And so we've been in this big era, this big focus. These last couple of decades have been focused on what? And they've been focused on profit, maximizing what we can accomplish and maximizing the profits we can deliver. In reality, we've lost sight of the fact that all of these things are delivered and rooted in who and in people. And so often now we are actually advocating these concepts of really putting who before what and people before profits, and ending effectively the era of what and ushering in the era of who, which begins with each one of you.
I love it. I love it. We're kind of coming out of, for better or for worse, out of this pandemic area of the last 2+ years, and some things have shifted, right? So some things have shifted, some people haven't. Some things are more apparent. It's kind of revealed some cracks or chinks in the armor. What are you seeing in terms of business and connection? What are you seeing in terms of how people are dealing with that? And what are some of the shifts that you feel like people need to be aware of as you're kind of working with people?
Yeah. So I think it's been interesting because these last couple of years through the pandemic, I think we've been on a couple cycles. I think that there was a really highly increased level of empathy and compassion and awareness for probably the first 6 to 12 months in the system. And what I mean by that is it was the first time in our history that the highest of high paid CEOs were level set to their frontline workers. Right? People were all of a sudden getting on Zoom sessions with kids in the background, and you're seeing different houses, and you're seeing the differences in income and capability and where people are living. And then all of a sudden people start getting green screens to hide what's behind them. And we're starting to then hide again elements of our life that were so transparent for a minute. We went into this complete place of complete transparency and vulnerability that the entire world simultaneously embraced. And then as it systematically moved forward, we started to see those layers start to go back up. Blurred backgrounds. Now mine's blurred only because it's got the right lens, not because I'm trying to hide anything. I want you all to see that. But right, we see these things where people start to then fabricate and control what the world sees in the digital world, like we've been doing in the physical world for a very long time. Right? All of a sudden, though, we also went inward. People started to connect back with their families, their communities, with their tight-knit groups, because that's what we were able to do during certain periods of that time. Right. And again, I don't want this to be anything political. This isn't polarized. This is just human behavior patterns that took place. Right. Then all of a sudden, everybody's tired of it. Right. And we have a huge portion of our population who's living in fear in some form or fashion. I'm not vilifying that. There's legitimate reasons for people to have experienced fear in lots of what's taken place. And then there's other people who are like, nope, I'm ready to get back to life no matter what expense. And we're doing this. Again, not polarized and politicizing this conversation. It's just what happened. Now you transfer that forward, and we've got this huge development and intake of the gig economy. We have more and more people working virtually and have no desire to go back to the office structure. Right? If they can be more efficient through the day, accomplish everything they want, and be connected to those they care most about through their home unit, and they don't have to go into an environment that might be triggering for them, because a lot of cultures are not healthy, right, in the workplace environment, then all of a sudden, what choice are they going to make as the individual? It further exemplifies the gap that we have in the talent gap, because more and more people are choosing to find ways to create money and freedom in their own lives outside of the traditional constructs and structures of corporate America. And so what's really happening right now is we have this shift and divide, I think, of certain leaders that are impatient to get back to production, high level of production. And obviously, we've got this economic hit that's hitting right now, too, that's changing a whole bunch of variables. But we've got people who are ready to get back. We have people who are like, nope, I don't want to go back. I don't want to live in the way that we used to live. I don't want to do the things that we used to do. I don't want to operate in the way that we used to. And I think that we've got portions of our population in the workforce that are really awake to that. They're looking for ways to focus on culture, building employee safety, building employee engagement, building like where and how do we go back to the basics around how we connect with ourselves so we can connect with our customers and have sustainable growth regardless of what's going on in the world and the economy. Right? They've really doubled down on technology and resources to create leverage and scale and better customer journeys and better outcomes. A lot of companies have doubled down in that area. They took advantage of this time. And there's others that were so significantly impacted that they're now on the other side of it, where they're hustling twice as hard to try to make up for what they believe might be lost time. And it's putting exponential pressure into other people's lives. So what we need to be aware of is the fact that, look, we have changed. There is no normal. We are existing in a new world. We are existing in a place that we have access and no friction to talk to anybody across the world at any level, because a 15-minute Zoom is really easy for anybody to get a hold of. We have more access to people than we've ever had. We have more ability to connect virtually and in person than we've ever had, yet we've never been so disconnected. Because people didn't actually take the time to feel the pains of this period of time so that they could heal through the impact of it so that we can move forward based on what we've learned.
So I'm glad you brought it full circle, this whole conversation, because that's exactly where I wanted to kind of go before we get ready to end. The difficulty of connecting when people cannot connect with their own pain. And talk about, because I remember I made this post maybe a couple of years ago and people didn't understand it, right? So, and I think but I want to hear your particular take on it. The difference between pain and suffering, and why that is so important to understand that. And as you perfectly phrase it, be willing to go through your pain to end the suffering.
Yeah. So I think it's important. I'll define both, but I think it's really important to also acknowledge what the world tells us, right? The world tells us to reduce, eliminate, or avoid pain at all costs, right? I mean, in any category, that's truly what it is. It's truly about reduction of pain in any area, whether it's numbing or healing or whatever. It's about not having it be there. And pain is actually a really powerful tool. I mean, it is a natural evolutionary response. So the old narrative really, the new narrative doesn't really apply to the old one, because 100 years ago, you cut your leg, you could die. You could, right? But in most countries in today's world, that's really not the reality. We've got modern technology and advancements so that our natural evolutionary response for fight or flight and survival isn't typically what we are trying to fight anymore.
Right.
We need to understand pain and we need to understand suffering. So pain is defined as short-term, intermittent, and a direct cause from something and alleviated after that direct cause is removed. Then we put adjectives in front of it to change the definition or keep it the same, whichever way you look at it. But acute maintains the definition because it literally implies it's short-term and intermittent, right? And chronic inherently changes it because it implies it is no longer short-term and it persists after that direct cause is removed. So let's stop calling that chronic pain and call it what it really is, suffering. We don't want to admit that suffering exists, particularly when it's a direct result of our choices. And often suffering develops slowly and incrementally over time, sometimes until its effects we don't even notice until it's too late and it's irreversible. Whereas pain gets lots of attention, real time. We spend so much time avoiding pain. And so the reality is, if we look at this concept, right, we can embrace the pain of hitting the gym for 30 minutes a day to avoid the aches and pains and suffering of a sedentary lifestyle. We can embrace the pain of a difficult conversation with our loved one or spouse to avoid the suffering of being stuck in a loveless marriage that's going to end in divorce, or being stuck in a marriage when you want out.
Right.
We can embrace the pain of the fit our kids are sure to throw by having them put down their mobile devices at the dinner table to avoid the suffering of years of lost meaningful connection and conversation we'll never get back. As business owners, we can embrace the pain of firing our top salesperson who's contributing the most to top line growth to avoid the suffering of stagnant growth and losing all our other top talent because they're the greatest cancer in our culture. We can embrace the pain of recognizing the areas that we need to go inward to heal and feel so that we can move forward to avoid the suffering of being isolated, disconnected, and feeling unworthy in perpetuity for the rest of our lives. The reality of this applies to everything in our life. And so what we need to understand, and like I said earlier, is that we all must choose our pain or our suffering will choose us.
We must choose our pain or our suffering will choose us. I can't let you end it there. We're getting ready to wrap up, but I love what you're saying there and just digging into that, because so many of us are unwilling. And I think that you mentioned about the fact that our society, the definition that we have about pain and suffering, pain in particular, because we want to avoid it, we actually prolong the suffering in so many different ways. And I love the fact that you are helping people to work through that and to connect. If there was one thing that you would leave the audience with today, what would it be? In particular, those who are entrepreneurs who are trying to build a life of significance, a business that is quote unquote successful. What is the reframe or the key insight that you would want to drop with them today?
I think there's a lot of people who are still waiting for a hero. They're waiting for a savior. They're waiting for somebody to come in on that white horse and save the day. They're looking for that next 7-step system to success, that next get rich quick scheme, that next strategy and tactic that's going to be able to help leverage their life, right? Because that's going to save me. I'll be okay if I make 7 figures or 8 figures. So this is consistent with everything we've talked about. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but I'm going to wrap this with encouragement and upliftment, I promise. But nobody's coming. Nobody's coming to save you. There is no hero. There is no savior outside of you. But what I want you all to pay attention to is the fact that you're listening to this right now or watching it or however you're consuming it. The reality of it is that you are here, which means that you are a survivor, which means that you overcome whatever life has already thrown at you. No matter how many times it's knocked you down, you've stood back up because you're here and listening. That doesn't mean that you're living life at the level that you want. That doesn't mean you're experiencing joy, freedom, and fulfillment at the level that you want. But the fact that you're here says that you are a survivor, that you are capable of moving through some of the most difficult times you've ever faced and make it through to the other side. Now, if we can do that in a way that we shine more light than we do darkness, into the way that we view the world, then we all start to create a little bit of freedom. You cannot exist in someone's shadow as long as you're shining your own light bright enough.
Yeah.
And so if we recognize that we are the only ones that can heal ourselves, we are the only ones that can be our own saviors, then what does that mean? There are guides that can help you. And I want to be really clear. This isn't a pitch to say, go lean into coaching. I don't think 95% of people are ready for coaching. But a guide could be your spouse, your kid, your best friend, your business partner, your mom, your dad, any one of these things, and just ask some questions. Hey, what's one thing about me that you love, that you admire, that you like, that if you could take out of my life and plug it into yours, you would take from me? What is one area that you believe that I'm blind and operating in a position that is not to my potential, or I'm creating damage or impact on other people's lives that if you had the choice, you would remove from the way I showed up? Open yourself to get feedback from guides who know you, who know who you are behind the armor, and allow yourself to lean in to do the healing necessary so that you truly can put yourself in the position to not just be a survivor, but that you can thrive by becoming your own hero, your own savior, and moving forward. Because we all have the ability to do that. And if any of you need help figuring out what that looks like, please let us know. Again, no pitch for coaching. That's just literally figure out, I could point you towards your guide if we spent 5 minutes together, and I'll tell you who in your life is going to be the one to give it to you.
I think that's powerful. Very, very powerful. Your website is on the screen. Tell people how they can connect with you, how they can follow you for more content, insight, whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
If they need help.
If you're on social media, go to @BogertBrian on any channel. You'll find us. BrianBogert.com is kind of the entry door into a lot of our world, all of our multiple different businesses. And we are truly here to elevate and empower. You know, you've been following for a little while. You see, we pump out a lot of content. There's not a lot of call to actions in it. There's not a lot of selling in it. There's a lot of content because we truly want to elevate and empower 1 billion lives as quickly as possible to do this. And the more people we move, the more we're going to have moving people, and the faster we get to that collective impact together. So I am asking for your help. If you ever see anything that you like, move it through the world. And I don't care about the vanity metrics. Turn your phone and show somebody. I don't care about the vanity metrics. I care about the impact and the movement through it. And so if we can help you in any way, free or beyond, we're here. Let us know.
More than a businessman, Brian Bogert. I'm really, really appreciative you spending the time with us, man. It's been great conversation. I know you've poured into a lot of people, and that number, that road to 1 billion, just got a little bit shorter today because of how many people you were able to pour into today. So I appreciate it, man.
Thank you for building a platform for me to pour good into the world, brother. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for you. So thank you.
Absolutely. I want to thank everybody who has commented. Forgive me for not mentioning all your comments, but we were really deep into this conversation. But I want to thank everybody who stopped by, whether you're watching on YouTube, Facebook, wherever the case may be. This show is also possible because of you. And so for Brian and myself, Frederick Douglass Bussey, I want to thank you again. Ever forward.